In the summer of 1985, hardware stores across Los Angeles County sold out of deadbolt locks faster than distributors could restock them. Gun sales spiked to levels the city had never recorded before. Families that had never owned a firearm in their lives stood in line to buy one. People who had always slept with their windows open on hot summer nights began nailing them shut instead, sweating through the heat rather than risk what might come through an open pane of glass in the dark. An entire metropolitan area of millions of people had organized its nightly life around a single, unseen threat. A man who broke into homes after midnight, seemingly at random, across an enormous and sprawling geographic area that stretched from the San Gabriel Valley to Orange County, killing with whatever was available to him. A gun, a knife, a hammer, his bare hands, and vanishing before dawn. Leaving behind crime scenes so varied in method that for weeks, investigators in different jurisdictions did not even realize they were hunting the same man. The press would eventually call him the Night Stalker. Before his identity was known, before his face appeared on every television screen and front page in California, he was simply an absence. A set of unconnected horrors that seemed to have no explanation and no pattern, striking wealthy neighborhoods and modest ones alike, without any apparent logic to his selection of victims beyond the darkness of the hour and the vulnerability of an unlocked door. His name was Richard Ramirez. He was 25 years old. And by the time Los Angeles finally learned his name, he had already killed at least 13 people and committed dozens of additional assaults, rapes, and burglaries across a rampage that terrorized the second-largest metropolitan area in the United States for over a year. To understand how this happened, and how a decentralized investigation eventually connected a chain of seemingly disparate crimes to a single perpetrator, we have to go back to a childhood in El Paso, Texas, to a specific and formative relationship with an older cousin who had returned from Vietnam, changed by what he had seen and done there, and to the years of escalating criminal behavior that preceded the summer that changed how an entire city thought about the safety of its own homes. Ricardo Leyva Muz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, Mexican immigrants who had settled in a working-class neighborhood near the border. His father worked for the railroad and was, by the accounts of several of Ramirez's siblings given after his arrest, a strict and at times violently abusive figure in the household, prone to beating his children for infractions both real and perceived. As a young child, Ramirez suffered a head injury after falling from a swing and striking his head on a curb, an injury that resulted in a brief loss of consciousness and, according to some of the psychiatric analysis conducted after his arrest, may have contributed to subsequent seizure activity and behavioral changes that some family members noticed in the years that followed. Though the precise medical significance of this early injury, like much of the psychological analysis surrounding Ramirez, remains a subject of speculation rather than definitive medical consensus. The relationship that would come to define Ramirez's adolescence and, by most accounts, plant the specific seeds of the violence he would later inflict on others, was his close bond with his cousin Miguel Mike Ramirez, a Green Beret who had served in Vietnam and returned home profoundly altered by his combat experience. Mike Ramirez would spend hours with his young cousin, showing him Polaroid photographs he had taken during his military service. Images depicting acts of extreme violence he claimed to have personally committed, including photographs that appeared to show him with severed heads of Vietnamese victims, along with graphic accounts of rape and torture that he described to the young and impressionable Richard Ramirez in vivid, glorifying detail. Richard Ramirez, by his own later accounts, found these stories and images fascinating rather than horrifying. An early and formative indication of a developing relationship to extreme violence that stood in sharp contrast to how most people, including most children exposed to disturbing material, would typically respond. He began to idolize his cousin, and the bond between them deepened even as Mike Ramirez's own mental state continued to deteriorate under the weight of what appeared to be severe untreated post-traumatic stress from his combat service. On May 4, 1973, when Richard Ramirez was 13 years old, he witnessed his cousin Mike shoot and kill his wife, Jessie, during an argument at their home. An act Mike Ramirez would later claim was accidental, though the specific circumstances remained disputed. Richard Ramirez was present in the room when the shooting occurred. He would later tell investigators and psychologists that this event, rather than causing him to recoil from violence, instead confirmed and deepened something that had already been forming within him, a kind of casual and unafraid relationship to extreme brutality that most people never develop. Following this event, Ramirez's behavior deteriorated significantly. He began using marijuana and later progressed to harder drugs, dropped out of school, and developed a pattern of petty crime, including burglary, that would continue and escalate throughout his adolescence. He was frequently truant, spent increasing amounts of time away from his family home, and by his mid-teens had developed a serious drug habit that required increasingly desperate measures to fund, contributing further to his escalating pattern of criminal activity. In his late teens, Ramirez relocated to California, eventually settling in Los Angeles, where he lived largely as a drifter, moving between cheap motels, abandoned buildings, and the homes of various acquaintances, supporting his ongoing drug use through burglary and petty theft. He developed a particular skill and comfort with breaking into homes, a criminal specialty that would in time evolve into something far more dangerous than simple property crime. During this period, Ramirez also developed an interest in Satanism, an interest that would become one of the most publicly sensationalized aspects of his eventual crimes, though the precise role this belief system played in motivating his violence, as opposed to serving as a kind of symbolic framework he adopted around behavior that was already deeply established, remains a subject that psychologists and criminologists who studied his case have continued to debate. What is clear is that by the time his killing spree began in earnest, Ramirez had constructed an identity around a fascination with evil, death, and violence that he would explicitly reference throughout his crimes and, later, throughout his trial. The killings that would eventually be attributed to the Night Stalker began, according to the most widely accepted timeline established by investigators, in the summer of 1984, though the full scope of Ramirez's crimes would not become clear until well after his eventual capture. On June 28, 1984, Jenny Vinkow, 79 years old, was found murdered in her apartment in the Eagle Rock neighborhood of Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her throat had been slashed with such severity that the attack was initially treated as an isolated and particularly brutal homicide, unconnected in the minds of investigating detectives to any broader pattern, since nothing in the available evidence at the time suggested this represented the beginning of an extended campaign of violence rather than a single tragic crime. The pattern that would eventually be recognized as connected began to take clearer shape in March of 1985. On March 17, Ramirez shot and killed Dale Okazaki inside her condominium in Rosemead, California, and shot and wounded her roommate, Maria Hernandez, who survived the attack after a bullet ricocheted off a set of keys she was holding in front of her face. One of the more remarkable survival stories to emerge from the entire case. Later that same night, Ramirez shot and killed Saileon Yu after dragging her from her car in Monterey Park, a level of activity in a single evening that, in retrospect, illustrated the frenzied and increasingly uncontrolled nature of his escalating violence. On March 27, Ramirez broke into the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara in Whittier, California, murdering both of them in an attack of extraordinary brutality that included mutilation of Maxine Zazzara's body. evidence that led investigators, even before they knew who was responsible, to begin recognizing a distinctive and deeply disturbing signature connecting this crime to certain elements of the earlier attacks. Throughout April and May of 1985, the attacks continued and expanded across an enormous geographic range spanning multiple counties and jurisdictions, a pattern that significantly complicated the investigation since different police departments, initially unaware they were pursuing the same perpetrator, were separately investigating what appeared to be a series of unrelated, if similarly brutal, home invasion crimes. On May 14, Ramirez attacked William Doy in his Monterey Park home, and though Doy survived the initial assault, he died several days later, becoming one of the case's confirmed murder victims, while his wife, who was also attacked, survived. On May 29, Ramirez attacked an elderly couple, Mabel and Malcolm Bell, in Monrovia, killing Mabel and severely injuring Malcolm, who survived but suffered permanent, life-altering injuries. On May 30, Ramirez attacked Carol Kyle in Burbank, sexually assaulting her while her 12-year-old son was bound and forced to remain in another room, an attack that, like several others across this period, combined the sexual violence, physical brutality, and apparent randomness of victim selection that would come to define the entire case. Throughout June and into July, the pattern continued to expand and intensify. On June 27th, Ramirez attacked Patty Elaine Higgins in Arcadia, murdering her in an assault of extreme brutality. The following night, June 28, he attacked Mary Louise Cannon, also in Arcadia, in another murder characterized by similarly extreme violence. On July 2nd, he attacked Deidre Palmer, a young woman who was severely beaten but survived the assault. On July 5th, Ramirez attacked Joyce Lucille Nelson in Monterey Park, murdering her, and in a separate attack that same night, assaulted Sophie Dickman, who survived after Ramirez, in an unusual moment even within the pattern of his crimes, allowed her to live after she pleaded with him, telling him she would pray for his soul, an exchange Dickman would later describe to investigators with a clarity that suggested she had understood, in the moment, that her survival depended entirely on whatever unpredictable calculation was ring within the mind of the man attacking her. On July 7th, Ramirez attacked Max and Layla Knighting in Glendale, murdering both of them. On July 20, he attacked Chainarong Covenant and his wife Somkid in Sun Valley, murdering Chainarong and sexually assaulting Somkid in an attack that also involved their young son, who was present in the home during the assault. That same night, in a separate attack, Ramirez murdered Elias Abawath in Diamond Bar by late July of 1985. Los Angeles was, in every meaningful sense, a city in a state of collective siege. Multiple police departments across Los Angeles County and into Orange County had by this point begun coordinating their investigations after recognizing the connections between what had previously been treated as separate cases, and a joint task force was assembled specifically to pursue the man the press had, by this point, begun calling the Night Stalker, a name derived from the pattern of nighttime home invasions that defined nearly every attack. Public terror had reached a level that fundamentally altered how the region's residents lived their daily lives. Beyond the surge in deadbolt and firearm sales, community meetings were held across dozens of neighborhoods to discuss safety precautions. Local news coverage was saturated with updates on the case, sketches of the suspect based on surviving victims' descriptions, and safety advice for residents. The specific randomness of the attacks, the apparent absence of any consistent pattern connecting victims by age, ethnicity, economic status, or neighborhood made the fear that gripped the city particularly acute, since no household could reasonably conclude they were safe from consideration as a potential target. On August 6, 1985, in San Francisco, several hundred miles north of the primary zone of attacks. Ramirez murdered Peter Pan and severely wounded his wife, Barbara. An attack that demonstrated the killer was not confined to a single metropolitan area, and that significantly heightened the sense of unpredictable, expanding danger the case had already generated. San Francisco's mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, made a decision during a press conference that would prove critical to the case's eventual resolution, publicly revealing specific details about a distinctive shoeprint pattern found at several crime scenes. Information that law enforcement had previously withheld as a means of filtering false confessions and verifying legitimate leads. This disclosure, made against the strong objections of the detectives working the case who felt it compromised a valuable investigative tool, would later become a significant point of controversy, though its ultimate impact on the investigation's outcome remains debated. Throughout August, the attacks continued. On August 17, Ramirez broke into the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson in Mission Viejo, Orange County, shooting Carnes and sexually assaulting Erickson. During this assault, Erickson noted a distinctive detail that would prove critical to the case's resolution: the license plate of an orange Toyota that Ramirez had used, information she was able to relay to investigators after surviving the attack. This piece of evidence, combined with the accumulated physical evidence from previous crime scenes and the composite sketches developed from surviving victims' descriptions, allowed investigators to trace the vehicle and, on August 28, 1985, formally identify Richard Ramirez as the primary suspect in the case, releasing his name, photograph, and criminal history to the media in what became one of the most extensive public identification campaigns in California law enforcement history, with his image broadcast repeatedly across every local news outlet and printed on the front page of every major regional newspaper. Ramirez, who had been in Arizona at the time his identity was released to the public, learned of this development when he saw his own face on the front page of a newspaper at a convenience store. He immediately attempted to return to Los Angeles, arriving by bus at the downtown Greyhound station, apparently believing he could disappear back into the anonymity that had protected him throughout the preceding 14 months of attacks. He was recognized almost immediately. As he walked through the East Los Angeles neighborhood near the bus station, several residents recognized his face from the extensive media coverage and began to raise the alarm. What followed was an extraordinary and largely spontaneous act of citizen intervention, as word spread through the neighborhood that the Night Stalker was walking their streets. A growing crowd of residents began pursuing him, and Ramirez, realizing he had been identified, attempted to escape by breaking into a nearby home and attempting to steal a car. The homeowner, Angelina De La Torre, fought him off, and as Ramirez fled on foot, he was pursued by a rapidly growing crowd of neighborhood residents, several of whom, including a man named Manuel De La Torre, Angelina's husband, physically confronted and subdued him, beating him severely before police, who had been alerted to the commotion, arrived to take him into custody. Ramirez, by the accounts of officers who arrived at the scene, appeared almost relieved to be taken by police rather than remain in the hands of the crowd that had captured him, reportedly telling the arresting officers, "Thank God you came. I am the one you want," an acknowledgement of his identity that removed any ambiguity about who had just been apprehended. The arrest of Richard Ramirez on August 31, 1985, effectively ended the period of active terror that had gripped Los Angeles for over a year, though the legal process that followed would extend for several additional years before the case reached its formal conclusion. Ramirez's trial began in 1988, and it proceeded amid extraordinary public and media attention, given both the scale of the crimes and the disturbing, theatrical persona Ramirez had cultivated throughout his pretrial detention and courtroom appearances, frequently displaying a pentagram drawn on his palm and making statements referencing Satan during court proceedings, behavior that generated significant media coverage and public fascination even as it complicated the court's ability to conduct proceedings with the gravity the case's subject matter demanded. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Philip Halpin, presented an extensive case built on physical evidence, including the shoe print evidence and ballistics analysis connecting multiple crime scenes, eyewitness identification testimony from surviving victims, several of whom testified in detail about their attacks, and testimony establishing the vehicle and license plate connections that had led to Ramirez's identification. The defense, aware of the overwhelming weight of physical and testimonial evidence, focused primarily on procedural challenges and questions regarding the admissibility of certain evidence rather than attempting to argue Ramirez's innocence in any comprehensive sense. On September 20, 1989, after a trial that had extended over more than a year and included testimony from numerous surviving victims describing the details of their attacks, the jury convicted Richard Ramirez on 13 counts of murder, along with numerous additional charges including rape, sodomy, burglary, and attempted murder related to his surviving victims. He was sentenced to death, a sentence delivered amid courtroom scenes that included Ramirez displaying continued indifference or, in some accounts, apparent satisfaction regarding the proceedings against him. Ramirez spent the following 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, during which his case proceeded through the extensive and lengthy appeals process characteristic of California capital cases, none of which succeeded in overturning his conviction or sentence. In 1996, while incarcerated, Ramirez married Doreen Leoy, a magazine editor who had corresponded with him extensively during his trial and had become one of several women who developed romantic attachments to him during his years of incarceration and media notoriety. A phenomenon that reflects a broader and deeply troubling pattern observed in the cases of several notorious violent offenders whose crimes generated significant media attention. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at a hospital near San Quentin State Prison, having never been executed. His death attributed to complications from B-cell lymphoma, a natural death that occurred while he remained under a sentence of capital punishment that California's lengthy appeals process and periodic moratoriums on executions had never owed to be carried out. He was 53 years old. The case of Richard Ramirez remains, in the collective memory of Los Angeles and in the broader history of American serial crime, distinctive for several specific reasons beyond the simple scale of his violence. The extraordinary geographic range of his attacks, spanning multiple counties and, in at least one instance, extending hundreds of miles beyond his primary area of operation, created significant challenges for an investigative apparatus that, in the mid-1980s, had not yet developed the kind of coordinated cross-jurisdictional response mechanisms that later became standard practice for major serial crime investigations. Mechanisms whose absence during the early months of Ramirez's rampage almost certainly allowed him to continue his attacks longer than might otherwise have been possible had different jurisdictions recognized the connections between their respective cases sooner. The apparent randomness of his victim selection, spanning an unusually broad range of ages, ethnicities, and economic circumstances, with no consistent pattern that investigators, even in retrospect, have been able to fully characterize, distinguished his case from many other serial offenders whose victim selection followed more identifiable patterns related to specific physical characteristics, occupations, or circumstances. This randomness contributed significantly to the particular and pervasive quality of the fear his case generated across the entire metropolitan region, since no household could reasonably identify themselves as being outside his potential of targets, based on any of the factors that might typically inform such an assessment. The manner of his eventual capture, effected not through conventional police procedure, but through spontaneous recognition and physical intervention by ordinary citizens in the neighborhood, where he happened to seek refuge after his identity became public, remains one of the more remarkable conclusions to any major serial crime investigation in American history. A demonstration of how the extensive public information campaign conducted in the case's final days directly and immediately translated into his capture once his face and name became known to the general public. The victims of Richard Ramirez included Jenny Vinko, 79 years old, Dale Okazaki, 34, Cy Leon Yu, 30, Vincent Cesara, 64, and Maxine Cesara, 44, William Doy, 66, Mabel Bell, 83, Patty Elaine Higgins, 32, Mary Louise Cannon, 75, Joyce Lucille Nelson, 61, Max Knighting, 68, and Layla Knighting, 66, Chinarong Kovananth, 32, Elias Abawath, 30, Peter Pan, 66. Alongside these confirmed murder victims, dozens of additional survivors. Among them, Maria Hernandez, Malcolm Bell, Sophie Dickman, Carol Kyle, Somkid Kovananth, Barbara Pan, and Inez Erickson, carried the physical and psychological consequences of their encounters with Ramirez for the remainder of their lives. Their survival owed in many cases to circumstances as arbitrary and unpredictable as the pattern of his attacks themselves. A set of keys that deflected a bullet. A plea for mercy that happened to resonate with whatever calculation was occurring within him in that specific moment. A spouse who managed to fight back at a critical instant. The pattern this case leaves behind is defined, in significant part, by the specific way an entire city organized itself in response to an unseen and unpredictable threat. The deadbolts and the firearms and the community meetings, and the fundamental alteration of how an enormous population thought about the basic safety of sleeping in their own homes. It is defined by the eventual, remarkable moment when that same population, once given the information they needed, took matters directly into their own hands on a street in East Los Angeles, rather than wait for the formal processes of law enforcement to catch up to a man who had, by then, spent over a year evading exactly that process. But most fundamentally, the pattern belongs to the 13 people whose lives ended across those 14 months, and to the survivors who carried what happened to them forward into the rest of their lives. To Jenny Vinko, who did not survive to see her death eventually connected to the broader pattern that would define her killer's name. To Maria Hernandez, who lived because of a set of keys held up at exactly the right moment. To Sophie Dickman, who survived because of words spoken to a man capable of almost anything. They are the reason the search across 4 jurisdictions never stopped, even before anyone understood how large the search actually needed to be. They are the reason a city, once it finally knew where to look, found him within hours.